Welcome everyone to Preaching Racial Justice, a conversation with Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. And our program itself is going to start in just a moment, but while participants are entering, I'll just remind you of our plan for this hour. So for the first 30 or 40 minutes, I'll be having a discussion and asking questions of Dr. Liz Theoharis. And then after that time, you'll be invited to ask your own questions. And you can do that by using the question and answer function at the top of your screen, at least it's on the top of my screen. You'd ask the questions and Vicki will read them for us. So once again, welcome, Liz Theoharis. It's such a privilege to have you here, and I know how busy your schedule is, so thanks for taking this time for preachers from Western Massachusetts, and I think we even have a couple from the Diocese of Massachusetts as well.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. So there's so many things to say about you. So I've got your bio here. Our guest today has spent over 20 years standing with the poor and calling poverty out as an institutional sin. She is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, the national call for moral revival with the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II, and director of the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary. Liz received her BA in Urban Studies from the University of Pennsylvania, her MDiv from Union Theological Seminary in 2004, where she was the first William Sloane Coffin Scholar, and her PhD from Union in New Testament and Christian Origins. She's an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA and teaches at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Her book, Always With Us, the question mark, What Jesus Really Said About the Poor, explores the false narrative spun by the misinterpretation of the anointing at Bethany in Matthew 26. Like poverty, racial injustice must come to an end. These issues are intersectional. In this moment of radical change, it is so important that we keep the mandate of God's justice before us as preachers, lay and ordained. The false narrative of white supremacy must be replaced with God's dream for us, the dream of the beloved community. So it's my honor to welcome the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis to our diocese for this important conversation. So as we go into this, Liz, it's, you might know our presiding bishop, Michael Curry. He's probably been at some events with you, right? And
Indeed.
He's urged our preachers to preach about racial justice. And so we're so grateful to have you here to help us do that, to help us find a way. So I'm really intrigued by the title of your book, Always With Us, What Jesus Really Said About the Poor. So I think it's a look at Matthew 26. So in the spirit of preaching, what would you say about Matthew 26?
Well, it's a great way to start. I've been, as you said, organizing amongst the poor and the homeless, those marginalized in society for about 25 years now. And a part of a movement of people of all races, led by those that are most impacted by injustice. And as I've been doing that work, there's really not a week that goes by in my life when I'm talking to whether it's congregations or community organizations, whether it's the scientists or religious believers, where someone doesn't say, but don't you know that Jesus says the poor will be with you always? And folks usually say this to justify an action in the face of racism and poverty, to say that if God wanted to end these injustices, God would do so, and to send a message that the only moment in people's lives when we'll be away from this kind of suffering, this kind of injustice, whether it's at the hands of the police or whether it's being suffocated by a society that has so much poverty in the midst of so much wealth, is when people die and go to heaven. And that the only response to poverty, to grave injustice, to racism is charity, and not systemic reform, not building a movement from the ground up. And so, I became very interested in this passage that people quote all the time, but often out of context, and particularly out of the context in which the Bible speaks about good news to the poor, freedom to the oppressed, and a year of jubilee for everybody in God's creation. And so, what I see in Matthew 26 is the story of a woman who has been marginalized by society, who comes in to a dinner when Jesus has just left, turning the tables over in the temple, engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience, and making the authorities, political and religious, quite upset with him. And she anoints him. She makes him Christ. She sees him as the Messiah that he is, and reminds him that Messiah is about, again, organizing society around the needs of those at the bottom of our society. But that the disciples notice her anoint him and get upset. And they say, why did she make this destruction? Why this waste? This could have been sold for all of this money, and the proceeds could have gone to help the poor. And so Jesus responds to this, and he responds with one of the most liberative biblical verses in the entire Bible, biblical canon, which is from Deuteronomy 15, where we're told by God that if we organize society around the needs of the poor, if we forgive debts, we release slaves, we pay people what they deserve, and if we lend out money knowing we might not get paid back, but if we invest in education, if we invest in healthcare, that our whole society will flourish. So he quotes that passage, but that passage in Deuteronomy 15 actually concludes with this point. But because I don't know that you'll actually follow God's commandments, the poor may never cease to be in the land. The poor may be with you always, right? Which is not a prescription for poverty, or that God wills and condones poverty, but instead that God has told us how we can end poverty, how we can end systemic injustice. And if we have this kind of inequality and injustice in our society, we are not doing God's will. So I think this is a key passage in our entire biblical canon that says exactly what we're called to do in a moment like this, in a moment when 140 million people in the richest country in the world were poor or one emergency away from poverty before this economic crisis, before this pandemic, before this next rise in police violence, before we've seen the great inequities that exist in this society. And so I think always with us, and what Jesus really has to say about liberation, about freedom, about organizing, and about the agency of those that are most impacted are really relevant for us today.
Well, you've given us a sermon now for Matthew, when Matthew 26 is not in the lectionary, but I think you could probably use that material in just about any sermon, because you bring up a question that people always ask. They say, well, Jesus himself said the poor are always with us. So,
that's right.
So thank you for the book, and thank you for that, those insights into it. So in this time together, we're so thrilled to have you to inspire us in terms of the obligation we have to preach about racial justice. What are the preachers that inspire you?
So there are so many, right? So I am very proud to be the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign alongside of the Reverend Dr. William Barber, who is a prophetic voice and witness in our world today. But I've also, gone back through history, both to find folks that were in organized religion, and then the preachers of Harriet Moses Tubman and Frederick Douglass, folks that have less organized of ministries, but a prophetic word to share with in the face of injustice and in the face of, other moments in our nation's history when there's a battle going on for the very Bible that we hold dear and sacred. Here you had, folks like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, not give up that Bible, despite the slave Bible being written that took out the Exodus, that took out the prophets, that erased all the mentions of freedom to the captives from Jesus's own words, right? But who still preached the gospel of good news to the poor. And I think, there are so many in our world today that are preaching that word, and Reverend Barber and Bishop Curry are two of those leaders. And I think that there's others. There are, I'm a Presbyterian. I'm very proud of some of the folks that have been out there, on the streets and preaching in their pulpits, alongside of the Poor People's Campaign over these past couple of years. And then there's those that have influenced those that influence me. I mean, I every morning get up and read the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Many of the words, especially from the last 3 years of his life. But then I try to read, whether it's Vincent Harding or Howard Thurman, or some of the folks that actually influenced him as well.
Yeah, Howard Thurman actually has been a subject of book studies here in the Diocese of Western Massachusetts. People have really looked at his work. So, the issues that are framed by the Poor People's Campaign have changed the way that we see poverty in America. How has this work opened your eyes to systematic racism, your work with the Poor People's Campaign?
Yeah, so, I mean, when we set out to build the Poor People's Campaign, we said that we didn't want to be loud and wrong. And so we've tried to base our work on empirical data and research. So we commissioned a study from some of the best think tanks, economists, theologians in the country, and put out this audit of America called The Souls of Poor Folk. And in it, what we found, and what we now share with others, is that there are indeed 140 million people who are poor and low income in this country. 4 million families that they can get unleaded paint, they can get unleaded gas, but when they turn their taps on in the morning, lead comes out of their pipes. 15 million families who can't afford water. We have fewer voting rights today than we did 54 years ago, despite people dying for us to have those rights. And really the statistics go on and on. 62 million workers who make less than a living wage, and not one community across this country where if you're working minimum wage, that you can afford to even rent a 2-bedroom apartment, right? So the realities, the depth and the breadth of inequality in our society is really kind of unimaginable. But how that impacts people, the demographics of who is poor and why people are poor. It's not that people are lazy, crazy, or not working hard enough. It's not that, that poverty just goes in these waves, and that if we just wait, for a season to pass, that things will be all better. It's not that, folks are living off of other people's good will, but really understanding how poverty and racism are structured into our society, and that it's going to take some really bold and visionary policy and structural changes to address them. I think that one of the biggest examples that has really shown me about systemic racism is looking at the issue of voter suppression. And right now we're in elections. We're in election season, and folks are talking about, people's right to vote, years after the Voting Rights Act, and also years after it's been gutted, as there's ongoing attacks on our postal service in a year when so many people are going to have to use the post office and mail-in voting to be able to cast their vote safely. But what we've found, even before this pandemic, is that since 2010, there are 26 or 27 states that have passed racist voter suppression laws using racist gerrymandering, voter ID laws, other forms of really denying people their right to vote, and particularly using racism and systemic racism, right, to disenfranchise African Americans, Latinos, other people of color, from actually being able to play the role that we're all asked to play, in building this democracy up. And what we see is that in those states that have racist voter suppression laws, they're also in those states the highest levels of poverty, the least environmental protections, the least protections of our LGBTQ family members. There's the most money going to the military from those states. There's really a whole host and connection between using racism to smuggle in elected officials who then pass policies that hurt everybody. First and foremost, people of color, but also in raw numbers, often impacting more poor white people, right? So in a state like North Carolina, where folks have fought and actually successfully won Supreme Court cases calling the racist voter suppression laws, unconstitutional, basically because of those laws, Medicaid wasn't expanded in that state, and levels of poverty have grown very high. And the largest number of people in raw numbers, not proportion, but in raw numbers, are actually white people who have been impacted by racism, by systemic racism. And so I think one of the things that we've seen in this campaign and in the work we've been doing and in the audit and other kind of policy documents we've put out is how these evils, as Dr. King talked about them, of racism, of poverty, and of militarism, are all inextricably connected. And that if we're serious about trying to eradicate racism, which is possible, which is something that our society could put its mind to, we also have to be talking about ending poverty, turning our war economy into a peace economy, and saving the planet. And again, we're often told that we're asking for too much, but it's actually costing our society more, both morally, but also economically and politically, to have the levels of racism, to have the levels of poverty that are currently in our society today.
So you've got that in that audit. So where would people find that audit? Would they look under the souls of poor folk? Is that where they?
That's right. So if you go to poorpeoplescampaign.org, you can go under the section called Learn, and there you'll find the Souls of Poor Folk audit. You'll find the moral policy agenda and the platform that we actually launched that's named for Jubilee, right? The biblical concept of the release of debts and of economic prosperity, community prosperity for all. We also have a moral poor people's budget, where we show, how much it's costing our society to actually have the levels of racial inequality and economic inequality that we have today.
Great. Well, thank you for that resource. And so much of what you're saying shows the interconnectedness of all this. And that's a powerful statement. I'm not sure how long you preach in your tradition, but in our tradition, we preach between 10 and 15 minutes. So do you approach it in a more simplified way in the sermon, and then encourage people to go to a forum later on to learn all the interconnections, or what's your methodology with doing it?
Yeah, this is a great question, right? I mean, I'm Presbyterian. I hang out with all kinds of Pentecostals and evangelicals and Episcopalians and Methodists now. But I was definitely raised to preach for 10 or 15 minutes. I sometimes can go on for longer, but yeah, I think that we have to bring a message, and we should, in those Sunday worship services and in those evening worship services when we have them, and that should be a message that is true to the gospel and the 2,000 texts that have everything to do with preaching good news to the poor. But yeah, I think there's other ways that we also have to kind of engage ourselves around these issues, and it's truly in forums, it's in protests, it's in marches, it's in any way of connecting with others who are like you and who are not like you, who are trying to improve this country and this world. And I think that for myself, some of the best teaching and action that I've engaged in has been when I've just thrown myself in with encampments of homeless people or organizations of low-wage workers, and from there experience more about understanding our gospel and understanding our sacred text and traditions than only only kind of listening to the word or preaching the word. In my own case, on Sundays, we have a sign that was really impactful to me when I was organizing amongst the homeless in Philadelphia that said, "Why do we worship a homeless man on Sunday, but ignore one on Monday?" And it reminds me when I look at that poster, I have it hanging above my bed, that indeed we have to preach this word in short and long ways in our services, but we also have to work it out in other ways in our world, in our lives today as well.
So I can't remember which president it was, but there was a president that was walking along with an aide or an assistant, and he just come from church, and the assistant said to him, "Well, Mr. President, that was a great sermon, wasn't it? It was a great sermon." He said, "It was a really good sermon." He said, I wouldn't say it was a great sermon. And he said, "Well, why wasn't it a great sermon?" And he said, "Well, he didn't give us something to do at the end." Mm-hmm. So how do you build in giving people something to do at the end?
Yeah, that's a really important question, right? Because I think a kind of a similar story when I was talking to some colleagues about sermons is where many of us will feel like we're preaching like a pretty similar sermon every week, and then folks will come to us and say, "Well, why are you preaching this same thing?" And folks will say, "Well, once y'all actually have brought this out into the world, and I know that you've actually heard it, then I can preach another sermon." And so I do think that this question of a kind of call to action is really important. And there is so much going on, and there's so much to do. Again, I every morning read this text from Reverend Dr. King where he says, "The poor and dispossessed in this nation live in a cruelly unjust society. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life." And so I think about that when I'm writing a sermon or when I'm sharing a word. How am I telling stories and sending people to a place where they know how they can help themselves or other folks take action together and to become this kind of new and unsettling force. He keeps on going in that sermon of his, and he says, "A freedom church of the poor, a nonviolent intergenerational army of the poor," right? And so he's talking about this idea of, and it's not just about only poor people, but like how as a society do we build a fusion movement of people from all walks of life who live out the very kind of creed of the country and the core values of our sacred text. And so I think when it comes to the preaching that we're doing, we have to bring that preaching to the public square. We have to bring it out into the world. We have to make sure it's relevant to the issues that are going on in our lives today. And we have to know that it's not enough just to listen to a powerful word, but it's important for us to then make a difference in the world with that word. And again, I think so many folk are doing this, and there isn't just one action that people are called to do, but instead it's being connected to others in our communities who are impacted by these injustices and who have said enough is enough, and we're gonna make sure we come together and build a world more like the one that the Bible speaks about.
Great, thank you. I'm sure there's been times when you've gone into congregations or gatherings to preach when you knew you were going to get a lot of resistance. So do you approach that differently than you might approach, a place where that people are looking for what you have to say? They're tuned into racial injustice. They want to hear what the next step is. So what's the approach when it's people are sitting back saying, "Well, I'm not sure I believe this, or the world's fine the way it is, or it's worked great for us for several hundred years. Why change it? So, in terms of your own preparation and in terms of the way you introduce the scriptures, is there a different way to do that?
So I think there's actually quite a few kind of parts to an answer to that question. The first is that I actually think whether you're going to a place to preach that you think folks already agree with you, or you're going to a place where people have, never considered the issues that you're about to bring, that either way, you have to start with the most controversial. I found for many years, like with that text that we started out with, the poor will be with you always, that I could go into a church and I could talk about Matthew 25, what you did unto the least of these, you do unto me. I could talk about blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. I could talk about, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. I could do a best hits, a greatest hits of all of the passages that folks already know that are all about poverty and liberation to the poor. But if I didn't take on this other text that actually people have interpreted to have exactly the opposite message, that it didn't matter if we had a great sermon, a great Sunday school session, a great Bible study about all those other texts, if I didn't take on, this like the assumptions that people came in with, which was that, but actually God wills poverty, that actually that the poor will be with us always. And actually, poverty is inevitable, even if I think it's unfortunate, right? And so I find that whether I'm going to somewhere that I know folks have been in the struggle for justice and in the streets with me, or I've been with, folks that have never considered going into the streets and have thought that life is going great for them and everyone around them for a long time, that you got to start with unearthing those assumptions. And those assumptions are in all of us, part of the reason I am so interested in these texts that have been used to justify poverty, to justify racism, is because I don't think it's just extremists that use those texts. I find others in the movement who still believe to the very core of their being that poverty is inevitable. We still have to fight it, right? But it's inevitable. I still, it's been other organizers and other pastors in this work who have constantly come back to, but I just don't know if we can win. I don't know if injustice is able to be conquered, right? And so my experience is that you have to kind of preach the gospel no matter where you're going. And sometimes the people that challenge you are the folks that, have never been in the fight with you before. And sometimes it's actually folks that are alongside of you that really want justice, but also just don't believe that it's possible. And so one thing is that I think we have to start with the kind of the biblical texts and the traditions that have been used to justify an action in the face of racism and poverty, and preach those wherever we go. But I also think that there is a role for prophetic witness and preaching, even if there's going to be pushback. It doesn't mean that you forget people, or that you leave people out, or that you don't minister to people. I mean, one of the folks that was really influential in my life was William Sloane Coffin, the senior pastor of Riverside Church, but also really active in the peace and justice kind of movement, especially in kind of white mainstream Christianity. And he always said to me, Liz, if you're going to push people on a justice issue here, then you have to minister to them twice as much over there, right? That like this idea that, you're only going to preach justice, that you're only going to push people, and you're not going to also back that pushing people up with, deep community ministry, really being with folks, both in their struggles around these justice issues, but also in their personal and private lives and individual experiences. And so, I mean, I find that we're not really being church if we're not doing both, if we're not pushing on these justice issues and trying to be as close to what our biblical texts teach us to do. But if we also aren't, ministering to people, whether that's with food or whether that's with time and prayer and attention. And I think, but that doesn't take us away from needing to put out a challenge. I mean, I think there are a lot of folks out there that know that something is wrong, but don't know that there's anything to be done in the face of that. And so I think we have to preach into that reality. We can't just gloss over and say, actually, things are kind of just fine. I mean, this is what Jeremiah tells us, like, things are not just fine. You're trying to put a Band-Aid on the wounds of my people, but those are deep wounds, So for a deep wound to heal, you have to put it out. You have to let people know about it. You got to, air it. But then you also then need to care for people, right? And you have to care for the people that have been wounded and the folks that feel like they're going to be wounded if we really air all of these kind of issues and injustices. And again, what we've seen over and over again in this work is that it works. It's true. People come and there's something building.
Yeah. It's the story that I told sometimes in Western Massachusetts, so some of our listeners are going to remember this story, is that I had a wonderful parishioner at the church I was at before being elected bishop, and he had been a member of the Nixon administration. And in the week before the invasion of Iraq, I preached all about how this was wrong. And I think I did it biblically, did it in a lot of different ways, but he was really upset with me after that sermon. And then a couple of weeks later, he wound up in the hospital with a heart attack. And I went to see him, and we prayed and we laughed, we talked about things, and he had this great line. He said, "Doug, we're not going to let a little old war get between us, are we?" And he said, and his name was Doug also. I said, "Doug, no, we're not going to let a little war get between us." But I still had to preach what I had to preach. That's just, but as you said, it's both those things. It's telling the story of which is true, and at the same time being pastorally aware and pastorally caring for people. We've got a few more minutes before I want to turn it over to questions and answers. So I'm just going to remind the folks who are watching to use your question and answer function at the top or the bottom of your screen, wherever that is, and send in some questions for Dr. Liz Theoharis, and we'll continue this conversation. So another question I would have for you, Liz, is I frequently preach about the prevention of gun violence. And just like you, I try and back it up with statistics and how interconnected it is to other things. And but I also try to put in some personal stories, whether it's stories where I've been a person who cared for somebody who experienced gun violence, or people in our community who have experienced gun violence, and tell the story so that it becomes real. Do you do that in your preaching, and how do you weave that in? What's your experience of that?
Yeah, so we have a saying in our work that movements begin with the telling of untold stories. And so much of the work that the Poor People's Campaign is focused on, and true at the Cairo Center, which I direct as well, is that we're working to shift the narrative, to get our congregations, to get our communities, to get our nation talking about the real issues that impact folks, but that to shift that narrative and to tell a different story, we have to shift the narrators, right? And so I think in my preaching and in my work, I think it's always important to include the stories. And in my experience, it's not just the sad stories of suffering that people are enduring in the midst of injustice, but it's also the stories of the kind of beautiful moral, political, economic agency of those who are at the bottom of society, or who are impacted deeply by these injustices, but who are also, helping to save the very soul of our democracy and of our nation. And so I think it is really important for us to both sometimes, what that looks like in some of the sermons I preach is that as I co-preach, or I multiple preach, right? And so I'll take some of the words, and other folks that are leading this movement and who are organizing, from their homeless encampment or from their low wage job, will also, preach alongside of me. But no matter what, I don't think it's the word until we've heard some of those stories. And again, these stories of the kind of what we say, the plight, the fight, and the insight of those that are most impacted. And so, what are some of the solutions? What are some of the beautiful good news that are coming out of our communities? We should hear both about, the water shutoffs that are happening in all across the country, but then also about the water affordability programs that poor and low income people are pushing forward and getting passed in their towns, and similar with the kind of policy platform that the Poor People's Campaign has put together. They come out of these struggles and out of these stories of poor and impacted people, and so we need to share those with the world. Indeed,
Plight, fight, and insight. It's a great way to remember that. Plight, fight, insight. So to tell the stories of people who are impacted so much by racial injustice, by poverty. Do you tell any stories of the heroes of those fights as well? I mean, they're the heroes fighting it, but like in our tradition, we often refer to Jonathan Daniels, who was martyred. I went on a pilgrimage with a number of people down to the Haynesville where he was murdered, and to tell those powerful stories where people can, feel the hope and also feel the commitment. So are there any kind of go-to people that you tell stories about that are?
So I think there surely are. I mean, there are folks that are, I think some of the real heroes and heroines of the work today. I tell the stories of many of the folks helping to lead these fights today, because I think they're going to be the folks that people will tell stories for years to come. Folks like Callie Greer, who had to bury two of her children, one to gun violence and one to the lack of Medicaid expansion in her state. Her daughter died of very preventable cancer because she just didn't have health care. And she and Callie has made it very clear that, her child will not have died in vain. And that's why she's organizing and lifting up, and that she's paid too much really already for her not to continue to fight. And so I find her an unbelievable powerful witness, a poor African American woman who is living in Selma, Alabama, all these years after the Voting Rights Act, but who's being denied her right to vote and being denied, literally the lives of her children. She stood in front of the U.S. Capitol and read the passage about Rachel weeping for her children who are no more. And she just wept and wailed until everybody in the crowd, the hundreds of folks gathered as a part of the Poor People's Campaign, were all weeping and wailing for, her and all of the children that are no more. And I think, the impact that continues to have on many people is profound. And we also, tell stories of folks that have come out of movement before who are inspiring us still today, whether it's from the Sharecroppers Union, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, or whether it's from various ones of the Black freedom struggles. I'm lucky. My sister has done some really powerful historical work. She wrote a political biography of Mrs. Rosa Parks and has done a bunch of work on Coretta Scott King. And so she shares stories with me that I get to integrate into my sermons on a pretty regular basis. What Mrs. Rosa Parks would say was that she, wasn't just a tired seamstress, who just didn't give up her seat one day. She had a long life of being rebellious, that in no way started in Montgomery at the bus boycott and surely didn't end. And that, she had decades of heroic activism. Often, people not paying attention, not listening to her voice, not seeing her deep insight. But, the role that she played, whether it was, in John Conyers' campaign in Detroit, or in the Poor People's Campaign, or in the anti-apartheid movement, just like over and time and again. And I think hearing those stories, both of some of the leaders that we might actually have heard of before, but hearing their fuller story, and imagining that because we hear their fuller story, that those stories could be stories of people like us and other people that could get involved in the movement. Even folks like Dr. King, who often feels like someone that no one could ever be like, but to then hear how he didn't want to, host that meeting for the Montgomery bus boycott because he had a young child, and he struggled for years basically with not really wanting to really being a reluctant leader, right? And I think so many of those stories and those histories are important for us today, and we have those leaders in our midst as well. Sometimes who have been around for 50, 60 years and we can still learn from, and some of whom have only been involved in the work for a couple, but who still have kind of great wisdom and experience to share.
Well, thank you for bringing up those examples. And it's been great having this opportunity to talk to you for the last 40 minutes. But I'm going to turn it over to Vicki now, because people have questions that they're lining up in that. Remember to go to that function that says Q&A and put your question there. So thanks for doing that. And Vicki, it's up to you.
We have a question from Elliot. And Elliot writes, would you say something about the historical and continuing strategy of the rich to turn attention away from disparity of income and wealth by pitting poor whites against poorer people of color and other groups?
So I think that Dr. King had this brilliant quote that he actually preached the night before he was assassinated, when he was in Memphis standing with sanitation workers who were striking as he was building the Poor People's Campaign. And he said how important it was for people to come together. What he was proposing in the Poor People's Campaign, and it was pretty controversial then, was that the weak point, the Achilles heel of racism, of poverty, of an economic system that exploits people, of militarism, was actually uniting poor people across racial and geographic lines. And so he basically said that if you can pull poor whites and poor Blacks and poor Latinos and poor Native Americans all into a powerful kind of alliance or coalition, that's how you can not just challenge poverty, but that you can really kind of undo racism and militarism and all of these kind of interconnected evils. And he said in that sermon, Pharaoh always had a favorite formula, which was to keep the slaves fighting each other. But that when the slaves got together, that's when Pharaoh was in trouble. And so I think indeed, those with real power and real wealth in our society do try to kind of take attention away from the kind of the growing inequality, the growing poverty amongst communities of color, but then also amongst white communities. In that 140 million people who are poor and low income, it's 65% of African Americans. It's 60% of Latinos. It's between 60 and 65% of Native Americans. It's only about a third of white people. But in raw numbers, 67 million of the 140 million people are white. And so what we're saying, and what Dr. King was saying, is that we have to figure out how to unite poor white people and poor Black people and poor Latino people into a powerful force to be reckoned with. And that when you are able to unite, not forget differences, not say that there aren't differences, even in poverty, even in people's experience of poverty. But when you can have people come together on common ground and stop this pitting of people against each other, that's when you can actually build a just society for everybody. And so I think it's really important. Well, one of the things that we say in the Poor People's Campaign and at the Cairo Center is that we have to make sure whenever we're looking at any policy that we have to disaggregate the impact that it's going to have on all different groups, right? That we have to see if this policy is about healthcare, are Black people going to get healthcare from it? Are Latino people going to get healthcare from it? Are white people going to get healthcare from it? Because one of the real sick and cruel ways that we've manipulated for many years has been to pit us against each other and not to find ways for us to come together in unity. Not around our differences and not despite our differences, but actually through difference, celebrating difference and diversity, but also finding common ground to lift the load of poverty for everyone. And so I think this is a really important strategic idea. If we're serious about justice, if we're serious about racial justice, we need to figure out how we undo systemic racism and white supremacy, including of pitting poor white people and poor people of color against each other.
Thank you. We have a question from Lee. Lee writes, so what would you say to white nationalistic Christians who believe, for example, that critical race theory is quote unquote ungodly?
So the Poor People's Campaign has identified 5 kind of interlocking injustices. We start with systemic racism, in part because it's really the original sins of our society, with the genocide of indigenous people, with the U.S. chattel slavery and African slave trade, with the unjust immigration policies we had from very, very early on. Just this building a society that's been built on white supremacy is just is just at the core of what it is to be in this country. And so we start with systemic racism because of that, and we connect it to systemic poverty, to ecological devastation, and the unequal impact that climate crises have on poor and marginalized communities and communities of color. We connect it to militarism and the war economy. But then we also have this distorted narrative of white Christian nationalism as one of the evils, one of the interlocking injustices that actually has to be addressed today. And I think what has happened over the past 50 years is that religious nationalism has gotten strong as our social movements haven't been able to kind of come together as much, including amongst religious leadership. And so what's happened is that many of us have ceded the territory, that somehow the moral issues of our day have been defined to be about prayer in schools, same-sex marriage, abortion rights, and no matter actually where people stand on those issues, we've defined those issues to be the only moral issues of the day, to the exclusion of healthcare, to the exclusion of living wages, to the exclusion of anti-poverty programs, of debt relief programs, of many of the issues that are actually at the core of our faith traditions. And so I think when it comes to this, I think first we actually have to be out there challenging white Christian nationalism. I think that is, as Reverend Dr. Barber, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign with myself, we, especially as religious leaders, cannot accept other religious leaders praying, P-R-A-Y, over political leaders who then pray, P-R-E-Y, on the poor, right? That is actually heresy. And we need to call it as such, and name it as such, understand it as such. And then I think, we can have a discussion and a debate about where people stand on different, on critical race theory, or on Bible literacy, or on various, issues that people, that either our President Donald Trump or others will get into a flurry of tweets about and policies about. But the reality of systemic racism and the need to understand the role it plays throughout U.S. history, but also in our society today, where despite, the majority of people in this country being supportive of a movement that lifts up and affirms that Black Lives Matter, we still have a rise in the number of people that are being assaulted and killed by police, that we can't just wish that away. We can't just say racism is canceled, without actually doing the work of undoing racism. And so I think we have to actually sometimes struggle those issues against especially white Christian nationalists on Christian terms, if that's at least how you identify. And so I think we have to be clear that the Bible has a lot of good news to those who have been marginalized, who have been killed. I think about the Beatitudes, and the first one in Matthew: "Blessed are you who are poor and cannot breathe," right? I mean, if we actually look at the Greek of Matthew's Beatitudes from Matthew, it says the poor in breath. I mean, that's literally, sometimes we translate it as poor in spirit, but it's in the Greek, it's poor in breath. It's poor who have been being suffocated, whether it's at the hands of the Roman legions, or whether it's because of a society that doesn't have healthcare, and that allows for low-wage workers to work so hard that, the expendables of Jesus's day lived for 5 to 7 years before dying, in many cases, like Jesus did, from asphyxiation, right? And so this is in our text, and it's, I think, our responsibility as folks that read and worship a God who is a God of justice, to not allow for Christian nationalists to be louder on the issues that the Bible takes up, when what the Bible is all about is justice for the marginalized, justice for the poor, and that all God's lives, including Black lives, really do matter.
Thank you. We have a question from Cynthia. What do you think Jesus would say if he came to Kenosha or Minneapolis or Louisville today?
So I think that's a really important question. And I think Jesus went to the Kenoshas and the Louisvilles and the Minneapolises of his day all the time. That's really where he was. What we know about Magdala, where Mary of Magdala was from, was that it had been so impacted by Roman legions that the people had been so subdued. There had been so many kind of uprisings that the Roman Empire had needed to subdue, that's the town where some of Jesus's closest followers are coming from. What we know about Nazareth was that it was the ghetto, that it was the poor. When Jesus is getting anointed as Christ, he's in Bethany, which in Hebrew means house of the poor. And what we know historically, socially historically about Bethany was it was indeed a place where the Roman imperial guard was not easy on the people, and that there was all kinds of tension and fighting, all kinds of violence, mostly at the hands of those in power, but also sometimes at the hands of folks that had been divided by the Roman Empire into seeing each other as enemies, rather than folks that could build a society for the better. And so I think exactly where Jesus was in the Kenosha's of his day, was of the Minneapolis and Louisville's of his day. And his message was this: it was, the Spirit of the Lord is upon you. He has anointed me to bring good news, to release to the captives. His message was, that you can't serve God and mammon. His message was that the way you should pray is like a persistent widow who keeps on going back to an unjust judge to plead her case and wins because she's so persistent. His message was that what you can do to get eternal life was to give everything you have to the poor and come and follow Jesus, right? I mean, he had a message of liberation, of justice, and not of just applauding essential workers and calling folks essential that we really think are expendable. He had a message of turning over the tables and of restructuring all of society around the needs of everyone. And so I think that's still the message today. It's that indeed we all are children of God, starting with those that are being beaten and killed by the authorities, and that we need to come together and build a fusion movement, just like he was building, to bring God's reign of justice and peace and truth to earth. And so I think we have a charge of what we're supposed to do in our day. And it's to really follow the texts and traditions that have been passed on to us, but that I feel are still failing to do.
Thank you, Liz. James writes, if you see new opportunity for addressing injustice as a result of the COVID pandemic, can you describe what you see?
So I think what we saw in the first weeks, first couple of months of the pandemic was a society that was willing to talk about some of the pandemics that existed before this public health crisis, that were making it so much worse. And I think that is obviously dangerous, right? I mean, to see the fact that 40% of families that were making $40,000 or less have lost a job or income, in the past 6 months. To see that, upwards of 30 million more people are without employer-based health care. To see, even if we have a moratorium on evictions, that people still don't have the means to pay their rent, and so when that moratorium expires, that really tens of millions of people could be out on the street. That's terrible and scary, and yet there is also a possibility there of us, I think, doing what the prophets suggest that we're to do in times of plague, in times of pandemic, which is it shows the foundations of injustice that society has been built on, and it gives us a chance to build up new foundations, right? To repair the breach, to restore the streets to live in, and to not structure inequality into the way society is. And so I think that if we stay alert, stay awake during this great time of suffering, if we don't let it become that we get so numb to the death and to the suffering, if we don't just let ourselves turn inward and fighting each other and blaming each other, but if we follow, I believe, again, the prophets, and we keep our society paying attention to the injustice, but also to to the solutions that exist. I mean, again, what we saw in the first week of this pandemic was that the Federal Reserve bailed out Wall Street to the tune of $1.5 trillion. Now, if they could find $1.5 trillion in basically a night, that $1.5 trillion is more than all of student debts combined, right? This narrative that we just don't have the money, it's just too costly, has been totally undone in this pandemic, because what we've seen is that trillions of dollars have gone, majority of that to bail out the richest among us. But those resources are there. It is possible to do it a different way. And again, if we remember that we're actually global citizens, we can see that countries have done it differently than we have. And that there are other ways. There's other ways of having a public health infrastructure. There's other ways of making sure that folks don't go without food. And that hopefully we can learn from this pandemic, especially when we're living in a moment when more climate disasters, when other pandemics like this may emerge. And this might not be the only time in our lifetimes that we have to deal with a crisis of this magnitude, but instead, perhaps it can be, a lesson for us to how we change our ways and get ourselves prepared for other crises, and in the meantime, really making sure that we care for those that are vulnerable among us.
We just have two more. Margaret writes, would you please comment on what you expect we will need to do after the November election?
So right now, the Poor People's Campaign is engaged in a campaign called We Must Do More. It's about mobilizing and organizing, registering and educating people for a movement, but a movement that votes. And we're really trying to get real numbers, especially amongst poor and low-income people, to both be heard, hear their issues and demands in the political arena, and to register and actually mobilize to participate in this election. So I can't say I know what's going to happen in November. What I can say is that we don't seem to be getting out of this public health crisis nor the economic crisis that's accompanying it. And what we know is that people on a massive level are going to need healthcare and living wage jobs and unemployment insurance, and we're going to need to pass a massive more stimulus bills. We're going to need, to figure out what we're doing in the face of education, and so, I would encourage folks to be involved right now with us in this election and in any way in your community, to vote about, we're a completely nonpartisan movement, but we are deeply political because we believe the gospel is, because the issues of healthcare and living wages and voting rights are all throughout those sacred texts. And so, what I do know is that we will need to keep on building power and pushing whoever gets in office on all the different levels, to make sure that actually we put people first and we center our policies around those who are struggling in this moment, who are really being abandoned in the midst of this abundance. And so, I think we know that no matter what happens in November, we're going to need to keep on pushing people. We're going to need to keep on building community and power across our differences, and we're going to need to make sure that we do actually not just put a Band-Aid on injustice, but figure out how do we rebuild these foundations. And so I hope that there are lots of congregations and organizations in your area that you can be involved. I follow the words of a leader, Fernando Garcia, at the U.S.-Mexico border in El Paso, who says that we are all about building permanently organized communities so that no matter what happens, we're there with each other, ready to to kind of build up the foundations and make sure that people's lives are what they are thriving and not just barely surviving. And so, I have more thoughts on all of that. But what I know is right now, from Labor Day to the election, that we need to save this democracy, and that means, participating in it, both with voting and with organizing, with mobilizing, and with holding our people, our politicians to account around the issues that impact us every day.
Our last question came in via email, and it brings us back to the pulpit. Michael asks, how is preaching racial justice different when you're preaching to a predominantly Black and brown congregation?
So I think one of the things that we have found in the Poor People's Campaign is that we have to preach racial justice everywhere we go. And so we'll be in the mountains of Kentucky in a town that's 95% white, and we got to talk about racism. And we will also be, in the Mississippi Delta in a congregation that's 95% Black, and we have to talk about racism. And we have to connect it to the issues. Now, my experience is that those that have been impacted, in the words of Frederick Douglass, those in pain know when their pain has been relieved, right? And so I think there's often a message of liberation, a message of we got to do this and fight. But I think that message actually needs to be wherever we are. That at least what we've seen organizing across the country is that from the hood to the holler, people are looking to hear some good news, because right now what they're getting is a lot of bad news of evictions, bad news of healthcare cuts, bad news of lost jobs, and that that's again impacting brown and Black communities the most. That's impacting poor communities the most, and that you can see when you listen to Jesus' sermons when he's preaching in Nazareth versus when he's preaching in Jerusalem, that he preaches justice. And so we can't be scared to preach justice in communities that are not facing lots of injustice, and we have to push our communities that are facing lots of injustice to fight for justice even more. And I'm sure there are folks in your diocese that are doing that all the time, and there's probably better examples and stories coming from you all.
Dr. Liz Theoharis, thank you so much for your time and for your wisdom, for your insights. We are all encouraged to preach about racial justice and its intersection with poverty during this time, and you've given us the tools to do that. So thank you so very much, and blessings on your ministry.
Thank you so much, and blessings to everyone in Massachusetts. May it be so that we find a just world.
Amen.